Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about developments in East Asia between 1200 and 1450, one of our main topics in our first unit. Our first unit is titled The Global Tapestry, where we basically take some snapshots of the political, social, and economic developments of different late post-classical period civilizations. We will look for trends, parallels, and points of comparison and contrast among these civilizations within the global tapestry. But this particular presentation will take a deep dive into East Asia. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these three learning objectives. 1, to be able to explain the systems of government employed by Chinese dynasties and how they developed over time. 2, you should be able to explain the effects of Chinese cultural traditions on East Asia over time. And 3, you should be able to explain the effects of innovation on the Chinese economy over time. You're going to notice that throughout this world history course, you will need to develop a sense of geographical comfort. You will find that the more familiar you are with geographic and regional references that I make throughout this course, the better you will be at making the historical connections of those references. So, where in the world is Asia? Or East Asia? When you think of East Asia, geographically, what are some nations you may think of today? In this course, if you hear me mention East Asia, these will be some of the modern nations, as well as their historical civilizations that I may be referring to. China, Mongolia, North Korea and South Korea, and Japan. Granted, a country like Russia, with its large geographic scope, actually spans most of northern Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. It would be difficult to claim that Russia is an East Asian nation in an ethnic, cultural, and societal sense. However, its geography and its political and economic interactions dictate that it does exist, at least in part, in East Asia. In our study of Unit 1 and the Global Tapestry, I will mainly be referring to China and its neighboring and nearby civilizations and states of Mongolia, the Koreas, and Japan, and a small handful of others. So let's look at China. China's political history has been characterized by one of centrality, unity, and imperialism, meaning the culture has typically maintained a single political system or government that has provided order to a massive population over a vast geographic terrain, and has even been able to extend its reach and influence to non-Chinese peoples living in the Far East. For example, the Han Dynasty of China, extending its imperial reach into parts of Asia and collecting tax and tribute from non-Chinese peoples, such as the Xiongnu, who were a nomadic people who lived throughout modern-day Mongolia and parts of southern Russia. Or the later Qing Dynasty, who took tribute and tax from the Koreans, from Laotians, and Vietnamese peoples later on in Chinese history. Historically, a dynasty or royal family has headlined China's political system. Through China's long political history, these dynasties have kept social and political order, continued political and legal traditions, and retained militant expansive tendencies. A dynasty was typically headed by an emperor, affectionately known as the Son of Heaven, a term that is comparable to the theocratic terms used to capture the religious and political nature of leaders and elites in other civilizations, like a pharaoh from ancient Egypt, Ramses II, or a Caesar from the Roman Empire, Augustus, and as an emperor from China, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi of China's Qin dynasty. The next several slides show maps of many of China's historical dynasties and their expansion throughout East Asia. On this slide, you see a map of the Qin dynasty, which has been credited as the dynasty that brought centralized rule to China after a 2-century civil war known as the Period of Warring States. The dynasty and its leadership embraced centrality, unity, and imperialism and set the groundwork for future Chinese dynasties to build from. This slide shows the expansion of the Han Dynasty in China's classical history. The Han Dynasty was a contemporary to the Roman Empire on the other side of the Eurasian landmass. The Han period in China, much like the Roman period in Europe, is seen by historians as a golden age in China's political development, imperial expansion, economic prosperity, and flourishment in literature, art, technology, and philosophy. After the decline and dissolution of the Han Dynasty, China once again entered a period of political disunity. However, as the historical process would go, a new dynasty would emerge and restore unity and centrality, and reconvene with the imperialism. In this slide, you see the map of the Sui dynasty of the early post-classical period. It, like one of its earlier predecessors, the Qin dynasty, quickly forced centrality and unity back onto China's subjects. The short-lived Sui dynasty gave way to the rise of the Tang dynasty. In this map, you can see its imperial expansion was far greater than its Sui dynasty predecessor. In fact, the Tang dynasty mimicked many of the imperial expansive tendencies as the earlier Han dynasty, as it expanded into Central Asia, parts of Northeast Asia, and parts of Southeast Asia during the post-classical period. With the Tang dynasty's demise in the 10th century, the Song dynasty would emerge. Moving away from the Tang dynasty's dependence on a large military, the Song dynasty gravitated to a political system that favored men of intelligence, formal education, and goodness rather than men of strength, military training, and bravery. This made it difficult for the Song dynasty to retain its centrality, unity, and expand as an imperialistic state. On this slide, you see a map of the northern Song dynasty, which governed a significant portion of China, but competed with emerging non-Chinese states to its north and west. Eventually, the northern Song dynasty succumbed to those non-Chinese states, and what was left to govern over China proper came under the southern Song dynasty. Well into the 13th century, the southern Song dynasty flourished economically, artistically, and technologically. It tried to continue China's political traditions of unity, centrality, and imperialism, but with the growth of nearby non-Chinese states, it was difficult to continue those traditions by the end of the 13th century. You may have noticed, as I have showcased some of China's most significant dynasties, that I point out how the dynasties were impermanent. For example, I mentioned things like how a dynasty, quote, declined and dissolved, and how a new dynasty, quote, emerged and restored centrality, unity, and imperial expansion. China's political history seems to fit a cyclical process of rise and fall. In China, a dynasty came to power through a triumph that garnered their leadership respect, reverence, and obedience from the Chinese people on a national level. A new dynasty would typically arise from a failed previous dynasty that could no longer keep political and social order. For example, the previous dynasty may have succumbed to internal unrest, such as a peasant revolt or civil war. Or the previous dynasty could no longer protect China's territory and population from external threats, like a foreign invasion. Regardless of the actual causes of a dynasty's failures, the weak dynasty would lose favor with the population and elite social groups of the day. In effect, the new dynasty would gain its recognition and legitimacy by putting to an end those troubling times and experiences. Additionally, the new dynasty would achieve social and political order and pave the way for a prosperous golden age, a golden age that would last until the dynasty had grown of age and had started to experience the troubles of internal and external struggles that it could no longer control. This was known as the Chinese dynastic cycle, a cycle that would characterize China's political history from the time of the Shang dynasty from nearly 4,000 years ago to the Qing dynasty that fell to a nationalist revolt in 1911, just over 1 century ago. China's political practices were grounded in two political ideological traditions. The first of these ideologies was known as legalism. Legalism was a political theory that, when put into practice, commanded political and social order by subject peoples. During the Warring States period in China between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, the divided states of China were void of political and social order, and centrality and unity. The Chinese state of Qin, which would emerge as the most successful and dominant Chinese state, employed legalist methods to quickly achieve political and social order. As a Qin statesman, Han Feizhi wrote in his political treatise, The Two Handles, quote, "Rewards should be rich and certain, so that people will be attracted by them. Punishment should be severe and definite, so that people will fear them. And laws should be uniform and steadfast, so that people will be familiar with them." Basically, if a subject conformed to the Qin state's laws, the subject would be rewarded and merited with protection, recognition, and favor. However, if the subject broke Qin law, that subject would be met with severe punishment. Once the Warring States period ended, the Qin state became the most powerful of all the states and claimed the mandate of heaven and sought to swiftly bring centrality and unity back to China. Utilized first by the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BCE and China's first emperor of a unified Chinese empire, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, legalism's harsh political practice forced obedience through the application of Han Feizhi's two handles. Qin Shi Huangdi also saw in his Chinese subjects a spirit of rebellion and rebellious activities. For example, nonconformists to Qin law were considered rebels. Likewise, formally educated men who gravitated to other ideologies and philosophies of the time were also considered rebellious and could be subject to swift and severe punishment by the Qin emperor and his political apparatus. Physical punishments, forced labor, maiming captured revolutionaries, and executions were typical actions taken by dynastic emperors who employed the latter of the two handles of legalism. As Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi set the precedent. Quote, "I have collected all the writings of the empire and burnt those which were of no use." He also buried alive Confucian and Taoist followers, and silenced alternative viewpoints in the late 3rd century BCE. The second of these two political ideologies was known as Confucianism. Confucianism was a social and political philosophy taught by Confucius and his scholarly disciples. As Confucius lived during the 5th century BCE At the end of what was referred to as the spring and autumn period in Chinese history, during the Zhou dynasty, his teachings would not gain popularity or potential utility until the period of warring states a few centuries later. Confucianism also strived for political and social order, but through different means than legalism's brutal obedience and collective responsibility. Confucianism expected leaders to govern with integrity, righteousness, and fairness. Leaders were expected to serve as role models rather than disciplinarians. Morality was expected to be cultivated as opposed to legalism's methods of forcing conformity. Order was to be achieved by understanding one's role in society and recognizing their relationship to others. Quoted by his students in a compilation of Confucius's teachings titled The Analects, Confucius claimed, quote, lead them by means of government policies and regulate them through punishments, and the people will be evasive and have no sense of shame. Lead them by means of virtue and regulate them through ritual. They will have a sense of shame and, moreover, have standards. In this excerpt, you can hear Confucius's critique of legalistic practices by suggesting that people only conform to law to avoid punishment, not because they are actually morally better as an individual. Confucianism also stressed filial piety and a respect and reverence to parents and elders. But that respect was not arbitrary, but rather it was earned through the individual fulfilling the purposes of their position in society. In essence, a father was not revered by sons simply because he was biologically the father, but rather he was revered because he served as a fair and firm father and as a role model to his sons. In most cases, one ideology did not supplant or replace the other. Rather, most dynasties employed a blend of the two schools of thought. Granted, the Qin dynasty did punish Confucianists and other nonconformists, basically propagated legalism. And just as much, the successor Han dynasty and its martial emperor Han Wudi promoted Confucianism as the official ideology of China. However, dynasties of later periods in Chinese history employed the most effective aspects of both ideological traditions. As much as Confucianism and legalism were native Chinese political traditions, they also characterize a lot of China's basic cultural tendencies. For example, law, imperial edict, and political and social institutions reinforce the role of family, the importance of education, and the expectations of men and women. However, one native Chinese tradition that seemed to reject the relative Confucian and legalist order of things was the philosophy of Taoism. Taoism downplayed the importance of attachment to a definitive role in Chinese society, and rather prioritized finding one's way to exist between the great forces of nature and the antagonistic forces of man. Finding the way was oftentimes achieved by individual Taoists who had given up on fully vesting themselves into China's families, cities, and rural communities. Rather, some Taoists sought solitude in distant landscapes, such as the remote mountains of northern China, in order to achieve a balanced life. This disengagement of Taoists was known as the practice of Wu Wei. Taoists rejected political and military action and embraced the arts and the early sciences. They believed order could not be achieved in mass, but rather achieved in the individual, which may have been why Taoism was never the favored practice of any Chinese dynasty in China's history. Taoists criticized both legalists and Confucianists for their promotion of political and societal mass order. And as the founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu was said to have declared from the Tao Te Ching, quote, if princes and kings could follow the Tao, all things would by themselves abide. Heaven and earth would unite, and sweet dew would fall. People would by themselves find harmony without being commanded. So, Taoism, less as a political ideology, developed more so into a cultural and religious tradition in China. But that did not mean that it did not have a practical goal for China's individuals. In fact, it can be argued that legalism, Confucianism, and Taoism were really striving to achieve the same goal: individual and social order. I would contest that the legalists had the swiftest and most direct route to achieving individual and social order, as demonstrated in the diagram on this slide. I would contest that Confucianism would certainly take more time in achieving individual and social order, but could possibly maintain that order far longer than a legalistic dynasty could do. Taoism seems to waver and wind in a much less direct route to achieving individual and social order, which was why it was never the state-sponsored political ideology of any Chinese dynasty. To be sure, there were plenty of Chinese emperors who were, in their personal practice, Taoists through and through. When it came to governing their country, they were strict legalists and functioning Confucianists. To be sure, Confucianism has had the greatest cultural impact on China throughout its history. It is the basis for Chinese morality, social hierarchy, and patriarchy. China's rigid social hierarchy of wealthy landowning nobles and formally educated scholar bureaucrats, who predominantly came from the wealthy landowning nobility, sat atop the social pyramid. Rounding out the bottom was the vast free peasantry of agrarian and urban workers, artisans and merchants. Social order was to be achieved by the engagement of an individual in their particular social role, and respecting that position as it related to the other social classes. Additionally, China's patriarchy was promoted through Confucian teachings. Filial piety spelled out expectations of sons and daughters toward their parents and grandparents, but also helped to define and shape gender roles. Marriage and property rights were typically arranged, but Confucianism also propagated that women were to be subservient and obedient to their husbands and fathers. By the time of the post-classical period during the Song dynasty, the practice of female foot binding had taken popularity among the nobility. Young girls had their feet bound tightly so as to keep their feet dainty and appealing to potential noble husbands. This Confucian-based, hierarchical, and patriarchal society was the culture of Song dynasty in China between 1200 and 1450. China did not only employ its own political and cultural traditions, but was also the recipient of foreign cultural influences. The most prominent foreign influence on Chinese culture was Buddhism. Buddhism was a philosophy turned religious belief that originated in India during the life of its founder Siddhartha Gautama, sometime between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. As Buddhism gained appeal in and out of India, it would be a few centuries before it diffused to China and other parts of East Asia, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. Buddhism has many different sections. Two of the most prominent sections of Buddhism are Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism, which involves Buddhists taking a more rigid path to enlightenment by living a life as close to the selfless life of Siddhartha Gautama, is a minority sect of Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, which involves a less rigid path to enlightenment, championed by Buddhists who do not live in a Buddhist monastery or prescribe to a strict monastic code, is the majority sect within Buddhism. In China, Mahayana Buddhism gained immense popularity. As Mahayana Buddhism made its way deeper into China during the late Han Dynasty, and continued into the post-classical period, many Confucianists were skeptical of its teachings of detachment from the material world, its emphasis on the afterlife known as nirvana. However, some Taoists actually embraced some of the ethical and moralistic teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. In one way, Mahayana Buddhism began to adopt some Taoist teachings through the learning and acceptance that resulted from Taoists communicating with Mahayana Buddhists. This led to the development of a Chinese sect of Mahayana Buddhism known as Chan Buddhism, which retained a lot of Taoist teachings. Mahayana Buddhism was also adaptive in Tibet, where Tibetan or Lamaist Buddhism would be practiced, which blended native Tibetan religious traditions with Mahayana Buddhist teachings. Another branch of Mahayana Buddhism that popularized in China and other civilizations in East Asia was Pure Land Buddhism. China was not just a place that absorbed a foreign tradition and made it its own, but China was also a place that altered its own native tradition by adopting foreign tradition. As Buddhism gained more popularity in China and Confucianism experienced a revival in the post-classical period, these two traditions melded to form Neo-Confucianism, a concept we will see throughout world history and familiarize ourselves with is called cultural syncretism. Cultural syncretism is the blending of native and foreign cultural or religious traditions, as in the case of Neo-Confucianism, which altered traditional Confucianism by incorporating some of the moralistic teachings of the non-Chinese ideology of Buddhism. Chan Buddhism is another example of cultural syncretism within China. As Buddhism's popularity increased, it was accompanied by a greater Chinese influence. For example, Buddhist temples and monasteries constructed in China took on Chinese architectural styles. Buddhist scriptures were translated and were given Chinese commentary so as to appeal to a larger Chinese populace. In this slide, you can see Chinese Buddhist visual arts that blend artistic and architectural styles with Buddhist and Chinese cultural influences. To the top left, you see a Buddhist monastery in Dunhuang, China, which is built in a traditional Chinese pagoda architectural style. On the bottom left, you see a large statue, also from the caves of Dunhuang, China. The statue depicts a Chinese bodhisattva, or an enlightened Buddhist who is eligible to achieve nirvana, or Buddhist salvation, but continues to work to assist others trying to live the righteous eightfold path and accept the challenges of Buddhism's Four Noble Truths. To the right, you see a Chinese sculpture of Amitabha, a Pure Land Buddhism deity that popularized throughout China and other locations in East Asia. This piece was constructed using native Chinese sculpture and artistic techniques and resources during the Tang Dynasty in post-classical China. These images serve as historical evidence to the cultural syncretism that occurred in China during this time period. China was also not a culture that remained within its faint geographic borders or within its rigid borders, like within the Great Wall of China. Rather, China was a culture that reached far beyond its borders to places such as Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. You may be familiar with the term Americanization, the process of an individual or people taking on the characteristics of American culture. In many ways, China also was a culture that influenced foreign peoples or non-Chinese peoples to adopt its characteristics. China's written language, literary traditions, political practices, and ideological foundations, especially those of Neo-Confucianism and Chan Buddhism, were diffused to Korean, Vietnamese, and Japanese societies during the post-classical period. The term that is used by cultural historians to describe this process of non-Chinese cultures becoming more like the Chinese is Sinicization. In places like Korea and Vietnam, powerful Chinese dynasties, like the Tang and Song dynasties of the post-classical period, became tributary states to China. In some ways, China's traditions were imposed through an imperialistic tributary system. However, Japan never came under China's political or military control. So the Japanese were really able to select which aspects of Chinese culture it wished to adopt. Primarily, Japan's selection of Confucian and Chan Buddhist traditions resulted in a mild alteration of Japan's native religion of Shinto and the creation of Japan's version of Chan Buddhism, known as Zen Buddhism. China, prior to the modern period, was also a culture of great economic and technological development. Through its imperial tributary system with Vietnam, a strand of Vietnamese rice was introduced to China during the Song dynasty. This strand of rice, known as champa rice, shown in the image to the top left, was a fast ripening rice that was resilient even when there was drought. This enabled Chinese food production to increase immensely, which enabled a great population increase due to its growing sustainability. The Chinese were also known for their great construction projects, like the Great Wall of China and the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal, which is shown in the image in the middle of this slide. During the post-classical period, the Sui dynasty engineered the Grand Canal, which employed thousands of forced laborers to begin digging the canal that would ultimately link the Yellow River to the north and the Yangtze River to the south. The Grand Canal linked up some of China's most populated cities and helped to integrate China's southern and northern economies. In fact, champa rice was introduced to northern China, a much drier region of China, and enabled great demographic and economic growth. The Grand Canal, which is still used today, runs more than 800 miles, starting in its northern point in Beijing to its southern point in Hangzhou. China was also productive in its bronze and iron works, dating back to its earliest dynasties, the Shang and Zhou dynasties. Into the post-classical period, the Chinese learned more efficient and productive ways to produce cast iron tools and weaponry, which had a great impact on their production of food and handicrafts. China was also known for its production of luxury items that were exported along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean complex to the elites in other distant civilizations. Luxuries like silk and porcelain, which is shown to the bottom left of this slide, became possessions of the wealthy, and as their demand grew in and out of China, the Chinese found ways to produce to meet those growing demands. Lastly, China was a technological giant when compared to other pre-modern civilizations. China's most significant and widespread technologies were papermaking, shown to the top right of this slide, gunpowder, shown to the bottom right of this slide, printing, and the magnetic compass. By the time of the Song dynasty during the post-classical period, China's economy became increasingly commercialized and flourished as a result of increased productive capacity, expanding trade networks, and innovations in agriculture and manufacturing. Each of these innovations would enable China's cultural progression, but additionally, each of these would be diffused and adopted by many foreign civilizations by the early modern period in world history.